Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walking Through the Bible. Unfortunately, there are some in society who have little regard for the poor. Some see it as solely the government's job to care for the poor, or the church's job to care for the poor. And while government, and to a limited specific extent the church, can care for the poor, the fact remains that God has given individuals the responsibility of helping the poor whenever able. That means not gouging the poor for things that they need, or perhaps discounting things for the poor, or perhaps giving things away, something that one would not do for those who have the means to pay for it. In Judea at the time of Nehemiah, there was a problem with how the wealthy were treating the poor. What was that problem, and how did Nehemiah solve the issue? Let's find out. So if you have a Bible with you, turn to Nehemiah chapter 5. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 13. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Nehemiah chapter 5, beginning at verse 1. And there was a great outcry of the people and their wives against their Jewish brethren. For there were those who said, "We, our sons and our daughters, are many. Therefore let us get grain that we may eat and live." There were also some who said, "We have mortgaged our lands and vineyards and houses that we might buy grain because of the famine." There were also those who said, "We have borrowed money for the king's tax on our lands and vineyards. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children. And indeed, we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have been brought into slavery. It is not in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards." And I became very angry when I heard their outcry in these words. After serious thought, I rebuked the nobles and rulers and said to them, "Each of you is exacting usury from his brother." So I called a great assembly against them. And I said to them, "According to our ability, we have redeemed our Jewish brethren who were sold to the nations. Now indeed, will you even sell your brethren? Or should they be sold to us?" Then they were silenced and found nothing to say. Then I said, "What you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies? I also with my brethren and my servants am lending them money and grain. Please let us stop this usury. Restore now to them even this day their lands, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their houses, also 1/100 of the money and the grain, the new wine and the oil that you have charged them." So they said, "We will restore it and will require nothing from them. We will do as you say." Then I called the priests and required an oath from them that they would do according to this promise. Then I shook out the fold of my garment and said, "So may God shake out each man from his house and from his property who does not perform this promise. Even thus may be shaken out and emptied." And all the assembly said amen and praised the Lord. Then the people did according to this promise. The rebuilding of the wall was going on in Jerusalem, but that didn't mean that there weren't other issues that Nehemiah had to deal with, for it is in this chapter that we find that Nehemiah had been appointed governor over Judea, not simply one in charge of rebuilding the wall. That is why, when there was an issue that arose in Judea concerning the poor, that Nehemiah had to deal with it. The problem seemed threefold. You had one group of people who had large families who had become indebted trying to feed them, for it seems, according to verse 11, that in Judea, money wasn't the only thing lent out. Food was as well, at least the value of the food was. Now, in today's capitalistic society, there might be some who would say, "Well, why was that Nehemiah's problem? For if they couldn't feed their children, maybe they should get another job, or possibly shouldn't have had so many children." Now, I suggest that shouldn't be the attitude of our society, but especially what it wasn't to be the attitude of those claiming to follow God. For Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18 says, "You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." The Jewish people were to look out for one another, including the poor, especially if children were involved. That seemingly was not going on here. There was a second group of people as well who were simply poor, not because they had many children to feed, but on account of them being poor from past famines that caused them to sell their lands so that they might buy food. The famines mentioned here don't seem to be present famines, but past famines. For when we get to Haggai chapter 1, we will learn that God did send a famine among Judea as punishment for not rebuilding the temple over 80 years earlier. Perhaps there were additional famines as well that caused these people to have to sell their lands in order to buy food from those who had some food. Selling land would be robbing your family of future wealth. But if the choice is future wealth or present death by starvation, the choice is sadly a rather easy one. And then you had a third group of people who had to borrow money in order to pay the Persian king's tax. Now in this, the people aren't claiming that the tax is too high, that it is unjust, or that it is somehow higher than the other nations would pay to the Persian king. They're simply saying that as poor people, it is difficult to pay any tax, for how can you get money from those who do not have money to begin with? Under many Western societies today, we have what is called a progressive tax system, where wealthier people pay a higher percentage than poorer people because wealthier people have more money that they can contribute. This system is in contrast to a regressive tax system where everybody pays the same. While on its face, this latter tax system sounds fair, for everyone is equally a citizen or a resident, so why shouldn't people pay the same percentage of their wages to support the state? The reality is, though, that when the wealthy end up paying whatever percentage the tax is, they still have more than enough money to live on once they've paid their tax, while the poorer person may not. A regressive tax system is what the Jews are describing here, one not based on percentage, but an actual value of money, hence why the poor needed to borrow. Now, all of these poor people had options. They could sell themselves and their children into slavery, something that they were doing. This slavery is not the brutal slavery that we often think of when we hear the word, but rather selling yourself into slavery in order to pay off debts. We have similar types of this slavery today, though not exactly the same, as anyone who has a mortgage with a bank can attest to. The type of slavery spoken of here in Nehemiah was regulated under the law of Moses, for Exodus 21 verse 2 says, If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. Thus, slavery wasn't a permanent thing, unless the slave desired it to be. It was temporary in order to pay off debt. There was another option available to the poor too, redemption of the land that had been sold. Now, of course, the poor person was unlikely to be able to redeem it. Otherwise, why would they have sold it in the first place? However, one of their brethren could redeem it. That practice was regulated in Leviticus 25, verses 25 to 27. If one of your brethren becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, and if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother sold. Or if the man has no one to redeem it, but he himself becomes able to redeem it, then let him count the years since the sale and restore the remainder to the man to whom he sold it, that he may return to his possession. Land was very important in Israel, for it was what was inherited among families, and so having this way of buying back land for your family was important. But even if one of their brethren couldn't redeem it directly, there was still another provision found in the law of Moses that could be used to get back land that was sold, the year of Jubilee. These regulations are found in Leviticus 25, verses 8 to 10. And you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, and the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land. And you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. All of these regulations meant that the selling of land would provide enough money to the lender in the form of future profits, while at the same time not impoverish future generations because of the present poverty. In other words, had God allowed the land to be sold forever in order to cover a debt, then the buyer would gain much more value than they bought it for they would have profits from the land in perpetuity. In Judea, though, it seems that none of these regulations are being followed. In fact, it was even worse than that, for they were also breaking Leviticus 25, verses 35 to 37. If one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Take no usury or interest from him, but fear your God, that your brother may live with you. You shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him your food as profit. Usury is the charging of interest for money lent, and although this practice wasn't banned in general, it was banned for use against the poor, whether it was money or food that was being lent. God was promoting charity here, not handouts that the poor didn't have to repay, but he was teaching that one is not to take advantage of the poor for profit. One can make money honestly by legally profiting off those who can pay. When Nehemiah heard these things, he was greatly disturbed, not at the poor people, but at the wealthy people. They were taking advantage of their neighbors, fellow Jews for that matter, by not following after the law, forgetting themselves that not too long ago they too had been slaves, yet God redeemed them. Several 7-year periods would have passed. One jubilee should have been observed, and usury being attached in order to redeem land before them was antithetical to what the law taught. And so this was why, after some thought, Nehemiah rebuked the nobles and rulers. He told these men that they needed to walk in the fear of the Lord and follow God's commandments, all of them. But Nehemiah wasn't holding these wealthy people to a different standard than he held himself, for he too lent to the poor without usury. Therefore, they needed to do so too, lest they call upon God's wrath to strip them of their wealth in the first place. And to their credit, they agreed to do so. And not only that, they restored to these people their land, vineyards, and the interests that they illegally took. In this, the rich were not hard done by. They should have given these things back already anyways and not charged the interest. So let's not feel bad for them, for they didn't feel bad for themselves. Instead, let's praise the Lord, just as they did, for God cares for even the poor among us. We'll conclude chapter 5, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Nehemiah chapter 5, verses 14 to 19, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. We thank you for watching Walking Through the Bible today. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. But if you like this video, we ask that you consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss out on other videos in our series, as well as share this video among your friends so that the saving message of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.